You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Tufts professor Justin Hollander to talk about his book, The First City on Mars. We talk about the importance of planning cities on Mars and what we can learn from Antarctica and the International Space Station. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Too many communities across the country do not have fair access to the resources and infrastructure they need to keep people healthy, especially in the context of climate change. The health impacts of climate change, such as respiratory illness and temperature-related deaths, are already being experienced, and while community leaders are working to build local solutions, they often don't have the support they need. The National Academy of Medicine's new Climate Communities Network was launched in response to this context. The Climate Communities Network will bring together local leaders from around the U.S. to work collaboratively to address the climate-related health challenges their communities face. Members are being recruited now to join the new nationwide initiative, which will help advance community-driven solutions to climate-related health inequities. Visit ccnmemberapplication.nam.edu to learn more and apply. That's ccnmemberapplication.nam.edu to apply by June 23, 2023. This message was brought to you by the National Academy of Medicine. Well, Justin Hollander, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, great to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that we had you on episode 350, and we talked about a lot of topics, including, how the built environment impacts people's minds. But for those who may not have listened to that show or may not know who you are, maybe give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I teach urban planning at Tufts University, and I have been interested in the challenges that we face here on Earth. The places that we all live in, and trying to do research and teach around different physical planning, real estate development, land use, and have done a lot of work around urban design. That's, I think, was the bulk of what we talked about last time. So a lot of my research is around, what does it mean to create experiences that people are going to feel comfortable in public spaces, and how do we create cities that are going to attract people and make them feel good about themselves and make them have low stress and want to come back to those same places.
For sure. Well, let's chat about Mars a little bit. What made you want to write a book about space urbanism and specifically aimed at the red planet?
So this project started about 5 years ago. And if you might remember, that's when The Martian came out. This was a film that was based on a best-selling book. And I think a lot of people got kind of caught up in Mars fever. And there was this sense that this was definitely going to happen. We got Elon Musk was out there promising to build cities on Mars, Jeff Bezos, NASA. So there was just this kind of like groundswell. And I was offended because while a lot of smart people were involved in this, a lot of scientists, astrophysicists, engineers, they didn't have any urban planners. The urban planners weren't around. And I felt like, if this is going to happen, we have a lot to offer, my discipline, my field. We've been doing this for thousands of years. And I wanted to kind of see, well, what is it that urban planning could offer to this conversation? This pretty absurd idea of settling another planet, but let's put it out there. So that was the genesis of the project.
Why do you think that urban planners were left out or not involved, or people didn't think about those specific issues and items?
So I think there are a few reasons. I think it has to do with the nature of this type of endeavor. It's so speculative at this point. And people, I think, are really worried and concerned about the pragmatics of getting humans there and having them survive for the first week, 30 days, something like that. And even though there's like these movies or illustrations about what it might look like in the future, there hasn't been a lot of serious attention to that. The serious attention has been to that journey to get there, and then making sure that people even have water to drink and air to breathe.
What exists, though? There must be something. I mean, I read the book. There's a few things that exist on space urbanism, but what exists out there ahead of your work?
There's quite a lot of fiction. A lot of people have speculated, and some of it is really impressive. Some of it's kind of well researched, and I'll point to the Red Mars series. But so within the science fiction community, there's been quite a lot of work, and I did try to build on that as much as was practical. In addition, NASA and other science agencies have sponsored research that has looked at some of these questions. A lot of it is really focused more on the architecture side. And then some people have kind of like taken that work and kind of built out kind of larger architecture. But yeah, what I had not seen in my literature review and searching was really this kind of a serious look at the city scale. What do we really need to be thinking about, and what are some of the lessons that we can bring from Earth?
Should we want to go to Mars?
Maybe not. But if there's something that I can say for sure about humans, is we will try. And it's not just us. I was talking to my friend the other day. I mean, you have ants in your house, Jeff? I mean, ants, think about them. They'll go anywhere. They spread out, but they're not alone. All animals, and we are animals, we're all like that. And if ants could get to Mars, I can guarantee you they would. They might not make it once they're there. But yeah, so it's just kind of like baked into our genetics that we want to expand and we want to go out there, and people will try. So in many ways, I think about this project of mine as, if you're going to try, I'm hopeful that this will be a template that will guide you so that it's more likely that you'll be successful than otherwise.
I've been really appreciative of folks and even pop culture that kind of looks at the realistic side of space travel, of, those types of things. And I think, as I mentioned before the show, we just released today's May the 4th, and we just released a Star Wars show, which is science fantasy, right? There's a lot of things that maybe you could take from it, but for the most part, there's things like hyperspace that, maybe we could come up with at some point, but it seems very fantastical. But I'm wondering about the realism of some of these science fiction shows and ideas, and what you think of those. I mean, my personal favorite is The Expanse, right? So I don't know if you've seen that show on Amazon Prime, but basically it feels like they show a realistic vision of what it would be like to have actual cities and colony on Mars, and also what would happen to humans if they came back to Earth, right? Like the gravity differences and this physiological impacts of space. And so I'm wondering what you think about those types of realistic attempts to portray a kind of spacefaring civilization.
So those kinds of attempts are responsible for entertaining their audiences, right? So they're not accountable for a accurate accounting of the pressure, of the air pressure, the air and the water. So I mean, I feel like we should look to those forms of entertainment or science fiction writing as useful. I mean, these are important expressions of the human experience, but I'm trying to do something in this project that's different and that introduces a much higher level of rigor and accountability. I have sources, I mean, actually, I've cited my sources. You're not going to see that in The Expanse.
How much do you think planning on Earth can be translated to planning on Mars in terms of urban planning?
Yeah, well, certainly when we're talking about challenging environments on Earth, so we're looking at there's like a whole kind of way they call them the winter cities movement. So I drew a lot on different research in those communities, places where it gets really super cold, it's winter for a long part of the year. And we're talking about also in the polar regions. These are places where access to plant life is minimal or non-existent. And then deserts also we can learn a lot from in terms of challenging access to water. How do you conserve water? How do you recycle it? And so, all those things are really applicable. And another thing I talk a lot about in the book is low Earth orbit. No, so we're not talking about Earth anymore. It's low Earth orbit, but we have colonized low Earth orbit. It's the tens of thousands or more of different space debris and satellites, but it's also the International Space Station. People have been living up there for decades. So, we have a lot we can learn from our experiences, our human experiences, both here, terra firma on the ground, but also, up there.
Well, tell me a little bit about ISS and kind of how that informed your thinking, because I think that it is actually much better kind of indicator of what's needed to be done than, say, science fantasy or science fiction.
The advances that they've made in terms of being able to recycle air, recycle water, recycle and manage waste, it's really extraordinary. And so, I think a lot of those lessons are directly applicable. The ability to be able to grow plants and food in the space station. This is all stuff that I drew on extensively in my research to be able to kind of talk about, what it would take to be successful on Mars.
So let's talk about the conditions of the planet itself on Mars. I mean, when you're thinking about Mars, what would future residents have to plan for? What would be the things that were the most necessary in order to not only just get there and hop around for a few days, but actually, sustain life there?
Mars is much further away from the sun, so on average, much colder. So that is a challenge for humans to be able to be properly heated. And so in our template that is presented in the book, the idea of living below ground was really a big feature that helps to kind of modulate temperatures. And so that's one kind of consideration. The other is just, air. How do you breathe? That's going to be really hard. There's a lot of science that has, developed techniques around extracting oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. Various types of test cases have been done here on Earth. And so there's some confidence level that might be successful. And then there's water. There's a question of water. There's pretty strong scientific consensus that there is abundant water sources on Mars. Most of it is subsurface, pretty far, and in the soils, in the regolith. So, that's not going to be so easy to extract, but it is possible. And you can also actually extract water from the atmosphere. There's believed to be sources of H2O, hydrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere, so that could be extracted as well. So, those, if you can cover those, you're kind of halfway there. And then in terms of the kind of like urban planning stuff that we talk about here on Earth, that's around managing mobility, thinking about different land uses and how they interact with each other. And then kind of coming back to something that I spoke with you and the other episode a year and a half ago is really, how do you create environments that people are going to be comfortable in? They're not going to be stressed out, and that they're going to want to spend time in. And that means certain types of shapes and forms. I've written and research about this extensively. My book, Cognitive Architecture, talks a lot about this. But yeah, so to be able to kind of bring those concepts and principles into the design of that built environment, I think that's just as important. And it's going to be just as important on Mars as it is here on Earth.
One of the things that, I feel like gets cut early on in terms of, trying to go to other planets or even spending money to get to certain places are the details, right? So you're just trying to do the basic thing and, get the basic thing done and make sure that you do it when keeping people alive. I'm wondering, the things that we care about and that are really important, but maybe, sometimes get left on the cutting room floor, especially even here in our urban environments, right? You have all these strip malls and things like that actually don't, attempt to, relate to people. I'm wondering how much, with limited supplies, with the want to keep people alive, how much could we make sure that your first principles are employed on the planet, make sure that we are designing so that we see ourselves in our buildings? And so I'm wondering, how you make sure that we let people know that these things are important and they shouldn't be cut for cost considerations or resource considerations.
Yeah, so that's always going to be a tension. One of the things that has been really fun for me is that book I mentioned, the Cognitive Architecture. So that came out in 2015, and then we did a second edition just 2 years ago in 2021. And in all those years, I've been doing additional research with collaborators, and we've really been able to find that these ideas are more than just kind of add-ons and niceties, that they're really so kind of fundamental. And we're talking about, whether this first Martian settlement is going to be the next Jamestown and basically everyone's going to die? Or is it going to be the next, New York City? That's really the question. And if you pay attention to the research that I've been talking about, if you pay attention to the psychological dimensions, then you can have a positive outcome in that. And that when the stakes are so high, the stuff is not optional.
You did mention in the book also McMurdo, a base that is on Antarctica that a lot of countries have, signed a treaty and have access to, and, nobody owns it necessarily. Taking over more efficient and time-tested building types to that place and how that relates to the idea of urbanism on a place like Mars as well. Do you have the boxy forms that are easy to erect, or do you build something like the chalet that's more special and feels more human?
Well, so I think that Antarctica has a lot of important lessons for us as we think about, colonizing Mars or the moon or elsewhere. It is a very unpleasant place to be. From the research that I've done, people are very unhappy there, and the built environment is definitely a factor. The chalet, the main headquarters, that's a building that is something that people have remembered, that this is a building that they connect with. And that's really important for shaping people's emotional well-being. But the other ones are not. And I think that the future of Antarctica is not bright, in my opinion. And that it has a lot to do with the fact that there hasn't been good planning, certainly hasn't been good urban design. And that's something we're going to have to kind of keep in mind as we think about these future colonization efforts.
There are important urban design considerations that you can take from that, too, because of the snow and the wind and the blinding whiteness of it all. To Mars, because of the need to protect humans from some of the atmospheric dangers, et cetera, there's a roundedness that is necessary, those types of things. What did you learn about those types of protections from an urban design standpoint?
Yeah, so there's no question that certain forms, the yurt has held up for probably more than 1,000 years as a design form that's very effective in protecting against wind impact. So that's something that has been employed in inclement climates, and I think we can learn from that. A lot of the stuff that we kind of learned from Antarctica is about snow. So we don't really see snow. We don't see snow on Mars. I can't say definitely because I've never been, but
right.
There's no historical record of snow in the recent history. So there it's more about like, how do you get vehicles around? One of the things that I wrote about was the value of, in a heavy snow area, of compacting roads and then pouring ice on them. Just like some techniques that have developed, through practice. So clearly we have lessons learned with respect to the Martian road system. What is it going to involve? And so one of the things I wrote about was that in terms of roads, you probably do want to do something that's akin to that, where you're going to crush up the regolith, make sure that it's heavily compacted before you start driving rovers over those roadways.
Something else to consider is when you're choosing a site where you might put housing units or domiciles or the buildings themselves, or where the roads might go or transit or those types of things. How do you figure out where you're going to settle on a planet that people have never been to?
Well, for that part of my book, I was able to rely heavily on a lot of work that NASA has done. Not only have they kind of identified some possible landing sites for future exploration, human exploration, but they've also convened large groups of experts to kind of consider, well, what even should be the criteria? If we're going to be taking something like this on, where do we want to be? And so it's kind of interesting, like a lot of folks will talk about how you want to start off with a very kind of flat area. Mars is covered with all kinds of sized craters, and then also has the largest mountain volcano in the entire solar system, Olympus Mons. So that's not necessarily a good place for a new settlement, is in their opinion. But there's other people who talk about, the value of being close to the equator, where that's certainly going to be warmer, just like it is here. You're going to get better solar exposure. So, these are, I think, some of the kind of considerations. We on Earth are really, really sensitive to, access to water, both fresh water and water for travel, for transportation. I think there's still so many open questions about, where water sources, which would most likely be subsurface, would be. So until we know that a little bit more, I think you have to wait on pitching your tent.
You mentioned the soil types too. I mean, there's different types of soil over the planet. There's probably dusty type soil. There's probably rocky stuff like limestone types of things. What would be consideration for that specifically in terms of the dirt that you're actually going to be putting down streets or roads or whatever on?
Yeah, so there's no question that is going to matter. And I think the biggest thing is really just how easy is it to extract moisture from the soil. And so if it's going to be really dense, very rocky, might be harder. So I think those are the kind of considerations that are going to drive settlement decisions.
On Earth, we tend to be lazy about consumption to a certain extent. And I feel like some sort of mission to Mars would have to be more, aligned with the ideas of preserving life that we're working on here for climate change. You have to have zero waste. You have to, do a lot of recycling, those types of things. How much of that perfect kind of world do we need to translate over in order to actually sustain life?
Right. And we talked about the International Space Station earlier, the ISS. I mean, the idea of a closed loop, that's what they strive for up there, but they're not even able to do it. So, I don't think we can expect any kind of a 100% closed loop on Mars, but for the purpose of conservation, you'd want to get pretty close to it, especially when we're talking about conserving air, breathable air, and water. But in terms of like food and waste, I mean, those are also things that you want to try to be careful about. And managing waste is a big deal. I was just reading about in today's newspaper. I'm in New York City. They're still trying to figure it out. They're deciding whether or not they should come up with a new system so people don't just throw their garbage bags out on the sidewalks. So yeah, we haven't quite figured out waste here. So I think there's still some learning going on, but that would have to be pretty well thought out before we arrive.
Cars, trains, bikes, or walking?
Well, biking is going to be, of course, different given the gravity and atmospheric pressure on Mars. But I am a firm believer, if we think about biking as one of the most efficient, lowest energy sources of transportation, and we kind of think about that as a way to build the city, build it out, I think that we're going to be in good shape. The proposal I've come up with at the end of the book really kind of builds bicycle and pedestrian movement as the primary way that people get around. But as you think about a city that's of a large scale, you do need to have other ways. And so there we built a network of underground trains that transport people. But ultimately, you will still need surface transportation. So, we also conceived this network of above ground rover paths that would allow for some level of getting around that way as well.
It's interesting to think about how transport might work in a place where, you start out small and then you grow over time. And I'm wondering how that consideration plays into things. Like if you're just starting a colony or whatever you're doing, whether that's settling or just visiting for a small amount of time, you might start very small, but you probably need to think about kind of the long-term expansion if you're going to be creating a civilization there. So what kind of things go into that thinking? Not just one small domicile or, research center, but actually a metropolitan area, I guess, if you think about it that way.
Yeah, if you think about like how hard it is to excavate a tunnel after a city's already been built, that is what we're talking about. That, if you kind of can be forward thinking and plan out where those excavations can occur, or in the case where there's underground lava tubes, there's naturally occurring tunnels are all over the subsurface of Mars and craters as well. So if you kind of build that into the original design thinking, then, you might be able to be more efficient later on.
How do you design a place also with light consideration? Humans need vitamin D. We need light. We also need, to keep us from getting the radiation that comes from the sun that we are protected from by our atmosphere here on Earth. What considerations do you have to have in designing buildings with light?
Yeah, no, it is a real paradox. Like you said, people do need light. We need psychologically and also for vitamin D and other benefits, but you get radiation with that too. So the answer is really about filtering out as much radiation as possible and also being exposed to that light at certain times of the day and being aware of the potential for there are different types of radiation. So There are definitely ways that can be managed, but people will need to spend a lot of their time, especially when they're sleeping, away from natural lights and protected from radiation.
You've been working on this book for a while. You've probably talked to a lot of people about the book. I'm wondering, what is a question that you haven't been asked but wish you would be?
You've asked some, really great questions. I don't know if there's anything else.
Is there something that everybody asks about?
They all ask me if I'm planning on going. Well, the answer is no. I have no plans. I mean, if anything, this whole experience of doing the research and writing it has made me appreciate the ability to be able to just go outside, breathe the air, feel the sunshine, walk around.
That's the feeling I got from reading your book too. And I feel like, I mean, I appreciate the thinking behind it all and the urban planning ideas and the need to actually build civilizations that reflect good planning. But at the same time, I do like being able to just not worry about whether I have oxygen or not, or, not worry if I have food or not. And, we have a drought even after so many rains. I'm sure we still have a drought here in California. And so that's constantly, and in the West, we've, the Colorado River and Phoenix has that problem too. But, for the most part, we don't necessarily have to worry about whether the sun's going to kill us or not if we go outside for 2 seconds. So, those types of things made me think, well, I think I'm probably a landlubber and stay here. I love science fiction. I love space. I love the idea of it. I love thinking about, settling the moons of Jupiter and things like that. There's lots of really cool ideas out there. But I think that for me, I'll watch it from a distance.
I'm with you on that one, Jeff.
The other folks can do that.
But it does help us, I think, appreciate what kind of planet we have. I mean, we have an extraordinary planet that can give us all of these things, all of our needs. So.
The first spaceship. And another thing is, on one of the examples that you were giving, because there's other people that have looked into some of these ideas, and, Kozuka had a design that was really, really fascinating. And one of the things, and I was looking at the detail of the design, I noticed that, they were thinking actually in the future about hospitalization. And there was an ambulatory ward and then also an isolation room, which caught my eye. Why would you need
COVID?
Why would you need, COVID, but is it for, is it for mental health? Is it for COVID? Is it for a disease or is it for anthrax that breaks out on the Martian planet? Those are the types of things that people think about. And I find that just fascinating.
Right. Well, you imagine any movement of humans or animals to Mars is going to bring with us anthrax. It's going to bring it with us COVID, influenza, right? All those things. So,
well, that gets to the other question about you mentioned also, we've colonized places before and it ends up with poor results and people being killed and people being enslaved and those types of things. So there's something to be learned from a history of Earth in terms of colonization. And I'm not just talking about, the British colonies or European or anything like that. It's happened through centuries and centuries of human existence where colonization has negative impacts that we should be worried about. Even if it has no human life form, there is an existing ecosystem there. What should we be worried about?
Right. Well, so I mentioned the Red Mars series. Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction author, he does this really great job across the trilogy of engaging with those questions, the kind of planetary preservationists, who really feel like Mars is just beautiful and it's perfect and we shouldn't change it. And then the other people who not only do they bring with them their diseases, but they actually terraform the planet by introducing CO2 into the atmosphere, emissions, and they warm up Mars to make it more habitable. So there's this really, really fascinating debate that kind of goes throughout the books. And so I think that it's a good question, and that what you're raising, that we've struggled as humans as we've spread out across this planet, and even places where there were no people, just the way that we've destroyed and damaged the natural environments, is that justifiable? And I think that is an open question. And I didn't weigh in directly in my writing on that. I think that's something people need to figure out.
The book sets out 30 planning principles for a Mars colony. Do you need to follow all the principles, or is it kind of like a pattern language where you pick and choose the ones you like the best?
Yeah, I think that it's up to the people who are going there to figure out if any or all of the principles are helpful. I do have a number of caveats, which is that as new technologies are invented and new science advances, those principles will need to be modified, but at least it's a start. It's a beginning of a framework that allows us to envision a city there that is built on this long and rich history of whether it's the colonization or experience doing transportation right or addressing other dimensions of the project. So that's my hope, is that those principles will hold up on some level, and maybe not all of them, but at least most of them.
And you take those principles and you develop your own city. I'm trying to, LF, is that how you say it?
Aleph, yeah.
Aleph. What do you like most about your idea?
Well, I have to acknowledge that it was built on all of the examples. I mean, this is not, I wouldn't say it's my idea. I mean, it's the expression of everything that was presented before in collaboration with my students. I had a lot of help with my students in conceiving it. And, I think, just trying to show what it could look like rather than saying, you should build this exact city. I'm just trying to join this conversation about colonizing Mars and offering this as one vision. I think it would be a nice place to live. I think it'd be okay. And I think it does put the human experience at the center. I've seen quite a lot of other designs, some that I didn't include, where it's just like this beautiful work of art from plan view. But like you have to actually live there. And many of these would be just awful. They're like an Amazon warehouse, I mean, it's just like nobody's going to want to live there. So yeah, so I think that's, if there's one thing I take most pride in, is that this particular plan is very human centered and tries to draw on some of the principles from this other research on urban design and experience that I've talked about before.
How do you want people to use the book?
Well, I think my hope would be that as plans move forward, and they are moving forward in a lot of different, both public and private, that this book ends up being a reference as people who are very serious and have resources to actually plan a trip, that they actually use the book as a reference. They put it on their shelf and that they refer to it and it helps them be successful.
I like that. Well, the book is The First City on Mars, an urban planner's guide to settling the red planet. Where can folks find it if they want a copy?
I think Amazon's the easiest. Barnes & Noble too.
You'd also get it at your local bookstores. I imagine they'll order it for you too, going to Bookshop or IndieBound or anything like that. That's where we usually send people to go and get their books.
Well, I would prefer that, yes.
Well, Justin, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Nice to be with you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.